From the Toronto Star, I'm Rudgy Mudler, and this matters. Your social thermostat is likely out of whack. As the world reopens, it's a good time to remember that isolation and a lack of human social interaction can have a detrimental effect on our mental health and cognitive abilities. Considering we are all coming out of lockdown, it makes sense that while we are excited at the possibilities of reuniting with people, we also feel some anxiety about those encounters. For all the things that we miss about the before times, being socially awkward with people is not one of them. But our brains now have to get used to being social again. And the good news is, the more you do it, the more it will adapt to the good times ahead. To talk about some of the research around the neuroscience of lockdowns and reopening, we are joined by Kareem Clark. He's a post-doctoral researcher with a PhD in neuroscience at Virginia Tech, and he recently wrote a fascinating piece about this. He joins us now to discuss it. Kareem, thanks so much for making the time to join us.
Oh, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here.
So Kareem, as I say, I found this really fascinating and I really want to get to the effects, but I think to the start of this discussion, we have to talk about something that you bring up in your piece, which is called social homeostasis. And I think, you describe it basically as the balance of social connections and how our brains tend to deal with them. I like that you called this a social thermostat. Can you just explain for us, what does that mean to us non-neuroscientists? What is our brain regulating here or coming to terms with?
Right. So the easiest way to think about it is, a thermostat in the sense that it senses what you're missing and it adjusts for how to correct for that missing piece. So the easiest way to equate it is to the hunger response. So when you're hungry, you crave food and you eat food, and now your hunger homeostasis is kind of reset. And social homeostasis, you don't necessarily think of social connections as an inherent need, although, evolutionarily, that is a need that our brains have. They've developed that social wiring because social connections are very important in the animal kingdom because it provides protection from predators. It allows for group cooperation with hunting and gathering. So in our brains, even though we're not in the wild anymore, we still need those social connections. So when our body is missing them, it craves them in the way that it craves for food when we're hungry.
So this is one of these things. We're all been under some various forms of lockdowns. And one of the recent studies that you mentioned has found that if we reduce our social interaction, we kind of have those social cravings, right? What did that find?
Yeah, so that is a really interesting study that was done very recently, that they isolated a group for 10 hours and had a separate group that they deprived of food for 10 hours with normal social interaction. And then they took them and imaged their brains with a process called magnetic resonance imaging. And essentially that lets us look at which brain regions are activated under certain conditions. So what was fascinating about this study was that they found that the same regions that lit up when we were hungry for food lit up when we were starved of social connections, even just after 10 hours of isolation, which is pretty incredible.
That is. So this is one of those things that proves that we need people. We need other people. Now, here's the thing. One of the things you talked about is what happens to people's brains when they're on lockdown. I mean, this can lead to anxiety and stress, right? What do you think people lived with and dealt with while they were alone or with only their family members for the last year or so?
Yeah, so there's a couple of great surveys that have been done. That's the easiest way to study this during our current situation, because all the things that we can do in the lab with animals obviously cannot translate as effectively to our current situation. But a lot of the studies have suggested that adults in isolation and children in isolation, they've all experienced some level of stress. There's a great Stress in America study that was just published a few months ago. But essentially, the common theme, the common thread in the world is that being away from each other has caused us to have increased anxiety and stress.
We've heard a lot about particularly younger people having mental health issues. But yeah, how is this manifesting itself, I think, in society right now? Are we seeing it, do you think, yet? Or is this something that we're going to be seeing over time?
I think what's interesting is that, obviously this is a little bit of speculation, but first of all, what's interesting is that it seems like the younger generations, the Gen Z, actually has the highest level of reported stress during this situation. And that's probably because that they are used to more social interactions that, all of us that have kind of maybe shrunk in our social bubbles over time have experienced. So, it kind of feeds into the whole social homeostasis hypothesis, is that when we have certain social connections, we want to maintain those. So, if you start with more and you're losing them, you're going to have a greater effect on the stress response system. And that seems to have been the case with the Gen Z population in particular.
One of the fascinating things that you brought up in here is the fact that, Antarctic expeditioners had shrunken brains after 14 months of social isolation. Here in Ontario, we've had the longest and one of the strictest lockdowns. It's been about 15 months. So one, should I be worried about having a smaller hippocampus right now?
You may want to run to your nearest brain imaging center and get it scanned. So yeah, it was kind of fascinating that a lot of these studies that we know about the brain and how it reacts to social isolation is done in the lab with animals. But we can, like I said, with brain imaging techniques, learn about what isolation has done to humans. In the case of Antarctic expeditioners or people who have been in isolation in space, for example, and even socially isolated prisoners, because social isolation is used as a punishment in the prison system. So in the case of the Arctic expeditioners, there was a study that found that the hippocampus, which is the brain's learning and memory center, was reduced in volume. It was shrunken. And typically that means that you have deficits in the ability to remember either in the short term or the long term, and then also an ability to kind of process daily cognitive tasks like, math problems and things like that. And there was even a recent Scottish study that was performed during the COVID pandemic. They actually reached out to some members of the population during the harshest lockdown weeks and found that their cognitive performance on certain tasks like decision making and learning and memory tasks were at their lowest during the harshest lockdown weeks. So even, whether it's 14 months or even a few weeks of isolation, it seems to have a pretty strong effect on our cognitive ability and actual brain structure.
I find this fascinating because this is one of these things. It's basically saying that, being around other people is just good for our health and good for our brains, right? Is that the thing to extrapolate from that?
Yeah. Oh, that's definitely true. And there's a strong link actually between the size of your social network and basically, health problems later in life or life expectancy. So they've done a ton of longitudinal studies showing that people with more connections, that the stronger connections they maintain into their adulthood and later years in life, that the stronger your social networks are, the better performance and life expectancy you have.
We'll be right back. Now, here's the thing. I think that, part of the good news is, okay, we've been on the bleakness about this and what our brains like are on lockdown, but you actually did have some positive things in this piece. And I think these are becoming very, very important as we enter a reopened world, because basically resocialization can just repair some of these detrimental effects, right? Basically, Kareem, I'm asking you, is it just party time?
Oh, it's definitely party time. So what's interesting is that, as bleak as it is, that it's saying your brain is changing, your brain is adapted to all these harsh restrictions. In the way that it adapted to those, it can adapt to resocialization. And that is what the research in the lab has suggested. It's what tons of human studies have suggested is that, in the Scottish study I mentioned, for example, they found that even just once the restrictions were removed, the same people performed better on the tasks that they gave them. So even though, as adaptable as our brains are to the isolation that we've experienced, it should also adapt pretty quickly to, reestablishing our connections. The interim may be a little bit tricky is the kind of point of the article was that there may be more stress levels because when you adjust that thermostat back to where it should be, there's going to be some adjustment period in your brain.
Let's talk a little bit about that. I think this is one of the things that, I'm excited about getting out back in the world and seeing people, but I also have some social anxiety about these sort of things. And I think, as you said, the point of the article is like, how do we reconcile these sort of conflicting feelings right now from a brain point of view?
Yeah, so I will clarify that I am not a psychologist. I like to say I study the brain, not the mind, although they're very closely interlinked. But at least from the research that we know, it seems that just slowly reintroducing yourself to those situations has beneficial effects. You obviously have to make your own decisions based on your own mental health, mental situations. I actually heard a lot of feedback from my article about introverts that said that they were actually pleased about the lockdowns in the sense that there was less social pressure to go to, group hangouts and things like that, and that they actually preferred that method of socializing. So obviously everyone has their own unique situations, but if you want to dive back in, just maybe some baby steps.
I'm sure you looked at a lot of other studies out there. Is there anything that when you found interesting that you couldn't get into this article or, are sort of watching to see in terms of what the effects are as we move forward?
Yeah, so I think what we'll see is that there will be a lot more studies related specifically to our lockdown situation. The Scottish study was actually one of the only ones I could find that was related to the pandemic. But I think that we'll start seeing more of that come out. thing that I couldn't really include in the article was the effects of chronic stress. And it's kind of hard to determine what is acute or, what is short term, what is chronic, especially when you're comparing animals to humans. And I think that a lot of the research kind of points to that the longer we are away from each other, the more we adapt to it. So then the less likely we are to desire to come back together. And again, like it's hard to figure out, what this 14 months, 15 months has done in that way. It may be very individualized. But yeah, so some of the studies that relate to our situation specifically are probably coming out pretty soon.
Obviously, a lot of these studies are coming from the animal kingdom. Any specific examples? I think you talked about marmosets.
Yeah.
in the piece. And obviously, they're really cute guys. But what was that study about and what did it say?
Yeah, so primate studies are pretty closely linked to our own brains. So they found that when we isolate marmosets, which are small monkeys, so these are adult marmosets, meaning that they've developed relatively typically. But when you take them away from their, a pairing that they've bonded with, a mate that they've bonded with, and then you hold them for a certain period of time, when you reintroduce them, their stress response is actually higher when they get reintroduced. So that they have a higher stress response when they're away and also once they're reintroduced. But I think it was a period of over 10 days or so, they eventually rebonded with their former friends and they actually had lower cortisol levels and stress response levels and had made stronger connections, it seemed like, from the data.
So that's actually a good sign in case you've got that friend that you just haven't seen or kept in touch with over the last 15 months at all. Basically the socially awkward situation that it's like, oh, hey, we used to be friends. Nice to see you again. How was your pandemic? That bodes well for that interaction, if perhaps we can get to it.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. It's kind of interesting to see that small little period where, their stress spiked, like when they got reintroduced, in a way that maybe like what you said, when we hang out with someone that we haven't seen in a while, where we get a little nervous, but then, at least with the marmosets, they adapted pretty quickly and hopefully we will too.
Kareem, was there anything personal that made you want to write this piece, or was there anything from your pandemic that inspired you in any way?
So personally, I've been in academic research for 8+ years. I have a PhD in neuroscience. And, the pandemic really kind of shifted the way I think about science in the sense that, we think about science, at least in the lab, as, do this experiment, get this result, publish this data. But, it kind of reinforced that science communication, over the last year has been in some ways not as strong as we maybe have thought it was or should be. For personal reasons, I thought, I want to start communicating more with the public about our science. And specifically about this piece, I got the idea because me and several of my friends were fully vaccinated. We've started having group hangouts again in person, and I just found my conversations being the awkward silence was just way harder to overcome and navigate through. There was one instance where I didn't know what to say to leave a conversation, and I just said, "Well, I guess we're done." So it's just. Scientists are obviously not known for their social prowess, but I think I, had performed better than that in the past. So, it kind of got me on the lines of thinking of what is known about the brain and social communication and isolation and all those kind of things.
It's a fascinating topic, and you already said you're not a psychologist, but what advice would you give to people?
Baby steps, I think, is what I've really seen is that don't feel the pressure to dive right in. Zoom actually has been helpful in these past few months. We haven't been completely isolated from each other. And that is what people in the Antarctic or in space do, that they communicate with their families over Zoom and other platforms. And, we're not a mouse stuck in a cage. We have had social connections over the last year, and just do what you're comfortable with.
Kareem, this has been a really fascinating and fun talk for me. Is there anything that I didn't ask that you think that our listeners should know? Any other animals that could give us some good advice as we go deal with the human animals out there?
Oh, yeah. So actually, I want to point out that I study zebrafish, actually. And zebrafish and fish in general have a bad rep for having a bad memory. And I just want to clarify that fish have pretty decent memories, and they even have social behaviors that are similar to us, that they like to swim in groups. And the whole 30-second goldfish memory is a little bit of a hoax or a misnomer.
Well, that's actually one of the fast things that you mentioned, too, because our memories falter without social interaction, too, right?
Right, yeah. So, that relates obviously to the hippocampus shrinking, but memory in terms of remembering tasks that we can perform, but also in the context of social interaction, social memory and the hippocampus is pretty important in maintaining, navigating a conversation. So we use our memories to recognize a familiar face, remember a name. We use our hippocampus to learn facial expressions and when we've been talking too long or things like that. So memory and social skills are very tightly linked.
Well, I think it's one of these things that, it's probably going to be tested because we're probably going to see some people in the next little while that we probably don't remember their names.
Oh, absolutely.
Just because it's been so long, right? And again, I think the best advice is just to be honest and be like, I'm sorry, who are you again?
Yeah, we can all stumble and tumble, but transparency always helps in those situations.
Well, Kareem, listen, this has been a wonderful conversation. I really, really appreciate your time. And thanks so much for taking the time to be with us.
Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to talk to you.
Kareem Clark is a postdoctoral researcher with a PhD in neuroscience at Virginia Tech. That's it for today. Thanks so much for joining us. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Raji Mudder, Adrian Chung, and Saba Etisaz. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattenden, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.